everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of the Let's Clear the Air Energy podcast. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Bryan Nix. We have a new addition joining us today who sometimes pops in, Mr. Kevin Broom, who also does our editing and directing of the podcast. So happy to have Kevin on board. And we're very excited to have today's guest, Mr. Roger Pielke Jr. He is a leading and somewhat unorthodox analyst of science, policy, and politics. He is currently a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and professor emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder. Go Buffaloes. He's the author of the Honest Broker Substack, which has approximately 40,000 subscribers and is a must read to anyone who wants to understand the state of climate research, discourse, and policy. So, Roger, welcome to Let's Clear the Air podcast.
It's great to be with you guys.
Definitely, it's a pleasure to have you. So, first off, why don't you give our listeners just a little bit of a rundown if I missed anything in that intro there and kind of what you're up to and what you're doing?
Yeah, I basically just do one thing. I study contentious issues where science and politics collide, which used to be pretty niche. And it seems to be a growth area, maybe unfortunately. But yeah, I do a lot of work in climate. I work on gender eligibility in sports, which is another contested issue, and dabbled in COVID origins. So there's no shortage of topics to spend time on.
So you've written about recent trends, lower emissions, forecasts, and slower warming have led to many in the climate community to move the goalposts. On what counts as dangerous warming and how have climate projections changed in the past decade?
Yeah, this is it's a fascinating subject, and it's one that most people aren't aware of. The scenarios that are used in climate research, and climate research uses scenarios of the future because we can't predict what's going to happen in the future. And so if you want to run a Earth system model to project future temperature changes or future climate change, that's not the starting point. The starting point is a climate scenario with projections of how many people will be on the planet, how big the economy will be, what sorts of energy we will produce, what sort of technology we have to consume that energy. And it used to be, the long story short, used to be in the 1990s, the assumption was that the world was moving towards coal. Coal was the dominant energy source, and the idea, their theory was, we're just going to get better and better. We're going to get better at extracting coal. We're going to get better at producing energy with it. We're going to become so sophisticated that we'll produce liquids from coal and displace petroleum. And coal is the most carbon intensive fossil fuel. Natural gas has half the carbon intensity for the same amount of energy production. And if you project a future that's coal heavy, you're going to have a lot of emissions. And that means you're going to have a lot of climate change. So the climate community has really, since the Paris Agreement more than a decade ago, used temperature targets for 2100 to refer to the magnitude of climate change. So I'll use that also. The Paris Agreement says we want to get below 2 degrees Celsius temperature change by 2100. 20 years ago, the climate community was projecting that the world was headed towards 4 degrees, 5 degrees, even 6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial values. And it turns out, and there's a Canadian economist named Justin Ritchie, who I've collaborated with, all credit to Justin. He did some great research more than a decade ago that showed that, you know what, the world is not heading towards a coal-intensive future. Those scenarios that we've been feeding in the climate models are too heavy on coal. And once you scale back the coal, you also scale back the projected climate change. Now, it doesn't make the problem go away. It doesn't solve the problem. But just to give you an example of where we are today, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has its annual meetings, they're called the COPs, Conference of Parties. They met in Brazil in December, and their final report said the world is headed to 2.2 to 2.4 degrees temperature change by 2100. It's not below 2 degrees, obviously, for the Paris Agreement, but it's also not 4, 5, or 6. The reality is the science has evolved, and climate change has moved away from what many people would have called apocalyptic and more towards what we would call problematic. Now, in parallel with that, this gets right back, it's a long introduction to answer your question. It used to be that people who were advocating for action on climate change would say that 4 degrees, 5 degrees Celsius, that's the threshold of catastrophe. Well, as the scenarios have moderated and temperature projections have come down, so too has the rhetoric. The rhetoric now says, well, maybe 3 degrees is the apocalypse. Some say it's 2 degrees. I've even seen published studies that say it's 1 degree Celsius. We're already in the apocalypse zone. And so it's been really interesting that what should be good news, we're not pumping out as much carbon dioxide as we once thought, kind of gets flipped on its head, and the threshold of catastrophe has successively moved down.
So the increase in temperature as the apocalyptic, say the worst one, does that just change because of modeling has gotten better as far as the effects we're seeing empirically? Do you know what's kind of spurring that?
Yeah. So when climate modelers project the future, they project an envelope of possibilities, and that's because we can't predict the future. And the main focus for a long time was the most extreme emission scenario. So Earth system models are fantastic tools. They're incredibly complicated. They're a great achievement. They're scientifically incredible. But the reason that the temperature projections have gone down really has nothing to do with those models. It has to do with the information that we feed into those models. And so if you feed in less emissions, you're going to have a less temperature change. So the models are great. They are doing their jobs. But it's our view of the economy and population and energy technologies that has really changed over the last 20 years.
So one of the things that you've observed and written about quite a bit is the decoupling of carbon and GDP, economic activity. How does that feed into all this? And does the continued progress, is that something we can continue to rely on, or is there something that we need nudges from the government policy to help?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is particularly fascinating right now, given the situation in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. John Kemp, who I follow, who's an energy reporter, posted a figure today for globally that the global economy is 3 times more carbon efficient, 1/3 less carbon intensive than it was in 1973 at the height of the Arab oil embargo. That means that the economy, we produce more stuff, more value using less oil, and it's true for fossil fuels. And that's good news. If you look historically, the amount of carbon dioxide per unit of GDP has gone down globally and in the United States pretty steadily for the last 60 years. And historically, the main driver of that has been efficiency gains. Efficiency is good. People in business like efficiency because you make more money. If you have less inputs and more outputs, that's great. And so there is this kind of natural tailwind pushing on efficiency. There are government programs and policies also, like CAFE standards, the Top Runner program in Japan, to try to push efficiency along. If the world really wants to decarbonize the economy, and I'm talking deep decarbonization, like reducing emissions by 80% or more, efficiency is not going to do it. We're going to have to switch out the energy that we consume and move away from fossil fuels or use fossil fuels with carbon capture. And so that's the real inflection point. I always talk to a lot of people who use, and my students always did this, they talk about the free market. There's no such thing as a free market, especially in energy. Government policy, incentives, corporate behavior. There is a market, of course, out there. It looks different for different commodities, but things are all interwoven. If you want to, let's say you want to expand the grid in the United States, or you want to accelerate the deployment of advanced nuclear. None of that happens without some sort of policy leverage being put on things. So the other thing, I mean, let's just say this, that if the world were able to maintain the historical rate of decarbonization of the economy, you just draw that line straight out. We hit net zero so the world is really on track and not so far off from some of the goals people are talking about. Let me say it's a heavy lift to switch out fuel systems and change the energy economy, but it's not the sort of rapid change that a lot of people talk about. It's a more gradual process over the better part of the century.
Yeah, so you probably anticipated my follow-up, and that is, do we need to get to 80% decarbonization to achieve climate goals? Of keeping the temperature below or around, say, 2 degrees Celsius.
This is a great question. It's a fair question. It's one that's not talked about enough. We did a study a couple years ago where we looked at this huge family of scenarios that were out there that had the world going from everywhere from like 1.5 degrees Celsius in 2100 all the way up to 6. And we just asked, of these 1,200 or so scenarios we looked at, which ones were current, which ones remained current in, they were developed in 2005. And we found that the world was right now, for the first quarter of the 21st century, on track for something like a 2.2 degree warming this century. Interestingly, that's the same number I just mentioned that the Framework Convention on Climate Change uses. But there will be an important policy discussion. Is that okay? Is that adaptable? Is that consistent with the continued use of fossil fuels at some level? Now, let me say that the state of the science is that so long as we are accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at any level, the temperature is going to go up. And so at some point we will face decisions, let's say it's 2.2 degrees and we reduce emissions by 50 or 60 or 70%. Do we want to pay to remove carbon dioxide? I don't think that's a 2025 question. It might be a 2050 or 2075 question. There's nothing magical about the 2-degree target in the Paris Agreement. It's a nice round number. If you look at the history, like many numbers in policy, round numbers tend to pop up and they become untethered from science. Other people like to use the 1.5 degree Celsius target, another round number. So the degree to which the world accepts climate change is a political question, and it looks really different if you're in India and you have a vast population of 1 billion people who India has 1.5 billion in growing, but about 300 million of them live pretty well and more than 1 billion don't. And so expanding energy access using fossil fuels looks pretty good. It's very different than if you're in a very mature economy like the United States or Northern Europe and you have options. So again, I just want to emphasize it's a fair question. It's one we should be discussing more. And ultimately, it's not a science question. It's a politics question.
Hey, Roger, that's probably a good segue. I know you've written a lot about peak population. I read a couple of your articles from the Dispatch and pretty interesting stuff. I was curious on the outlook of population in the future and then how that, if it is even incorporated into these models, or if it should be, and then what would that look like? So I know you talk about we are using more energy as a nation develops and things like that, but also the population is starting to decline. So speak a little bit on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is another, if the scenarios are, one of the best kept secrets about future climate change, a close runner up is the changing perspective of demographers on global population. There is some serious thought being given now to the idea that the population on the planet is going to peak soon after mid-century, 9.5 billion, somewhere around there, maybe less, some maybe more. And just to give you a sense of how different that is than what we used to think, the leading scenario used in climate research has almost 13 billion people in 2100 and still growing. Why this is important is that fewer people means less climate change because there's less energy consuming activity that's out there. And so the numbers I gave you don't even factor in these changing perspectives on population. I did a little, back of the envelope rough analysis of, what would it mean for these scenarios if we just pull out the real high population projections and plug in the low ones. It's more complicated than that, but it was kind of a back of the envelope. And what I came up with, and people can check my math on my Substack, is we could get pretty close to that 2-degree target if we plug in these population numbers. And so does that mean climate change goes away? No, it sure doesn't, but it does mean it's a sort of a different problem than we thought it was 20 years ago. Peak population is really important for many reasons beyond climate change. The nature of our economies and social safety nets, people who like Social Security and healthcare. The idea is that, the growing population pays for the oldies. And if the population's shifting, we're going to need to think about the workforce. Do we need more robots? Is AI going to step in? How do we get the human power that we've depended on in the future? So it's a fascinating and really an important issue. In my parents' generation, there was a lot of concern in the 60s and 70s over overpopulation. We're going to have famines and so on. And a lot of people are aware of that. And that kind of faded away as the scenarios moderated. I'm pretty sure my kids' generation is going to be hearing a lot about underpopulation, population collapse. It is amazing to see discussions in China over concerns about not having enough people. And The demographic collapse in many places around the world, is going to be an increasingly important policy issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the 60s and 70s, it was global cooling and overpopulation, and now we're in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, it just tells us that if you want to project what the crises are going to be many decades into the future, number one, good luck. Number two, it's a thing you're not talking about that's probably going to show up and be really important.
So as we are in the throes of spring and we know that there is wild weather that we hear about in the news, tornadoes, floods, etc., you've noted that linking climate change to extreme weather is often pretty misleading since most disaster trends haven't shown real significant increases. So how should we interpret claims that say climate change makes this event worse? And what does the evidence actually show current disasters and their human links?
Yeah. So I always tell people to start with the assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. It's not a truth machine. It's not a Bible, but it is a fair effort by scientists around the world to summarize what we think we know at a particular point in time and what we don't about climate change. The IPCC, since it was formed in 1988, has been remarkably consistent on extreme weather events. Again, this is something most people aren't aware of. There are some extreme weather phenomena that have become more intense or more common. Heat waves, most notably. Those have been attributed to increasing greenhouse gases. Extreme precipitation in some places at some level of confidence has also been attributed. After that, it's pretty thin. There has been no detection of increases in hurricanes, more generally tropical cyclones around the world, flooding, meteorological or hydrological drought, for example, winter storms. And so if we start with the IPCC, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily correct, but boy, they've done a very good job looking at the science. And this is an area I've studied also. What happened, and there's always a deeper story here, is that over a decade ago, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, came out spring of 2006. There was a decision made by people advocating for changes to energy policy due to climate change to latch onto extreme weather. And the idea was, well, if you tell somebody there's going to be a 2.5 degree temperature change in 2100, they'll be like, okay, yeah, I got to go pick up the kids from soccer. Call me in 2099. The idea was that it wasn't motivating enough to get the normal person to support climate policies. There was a very conscious decision to make extreme weather the face of climate change. Why? I mean, extreme weather is a great promotional tool. You guaranteed it. There's something extreme is happening somewhere in this country or around the world every single day. And it's very photogenic. It's scary. And it gives advocates something to latch onto. The problem is that the advocacy departed from the science and has for a long time. There are other incentives too beyond climate politics. I was 24 years at the University of Colorado. University press offices love studies that have, eye-popping results. More hurricanes, more floods. A lot of this comes out of projections of the future using very extreme scenarios. The major media, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, likes the idea of promoting climate change. There's a climate beat that has emerged remarkably in the media. So there's a lot of incentives to promote extreme weather. And I guess the unfortunate thing is just it's departed from where the science really is on a lot of these topics. I will say I published a piece on this. 2025, within measurement error, as near as we can tell, saw the fewest people die from extreme weather events around the world in recorded human history. People don't really appreciate the fact that there's a lot of extreme weather that happens around the world. In the 1870s, there was a major El Nino event, and estimates are that because of drought primarily, but also floods and hurricanes around the world, 4% of the global population died from extreme weather. 4% today is something like 350 million people. So the fact that there was 5 to 10,000 people that died last year is tragic, but boy, the world has made enormous progress with respect to extreme weather events. I mean, my view very much is there's a lot of good justifications for smarter energy policies nationally and globally, but protecting people from extreme weather is probably not on that list.
How should this, how we focus our resources, right? Versus adaptation or mitigation. I mean, just common sense as people continue to move to the coast. We still have hurricanes, we still have floods. So, where do you think that should go?
So, I mean, there's a few things there, and let's set aside energy policy for the moment. There's lots to talk about on energy policy, but if the goal is to reduce the material impacts of climate change, climate variability on humans, we're really good at that. If you look, I mean, one of the best success stories of science, technology, and policy of the last half century is in the Indian Ocean. I have a paper, I think it's from the Monthly Weather Review in the 1960s, and it has a table in it of the number of people who died from Indian Ocean cyclones every year in the 1960s. And the numbers are mind-boggling. 20,000, 40,000, 30,000, 100,000. 1971, so a massive 130,000 people die in a single tropical cyclone. There have been, in 2008 was a big year with the tropical cyclone, but more recently with warnings that get out to people, with evacuation routes, with sheltering, we do a lot better. We just wrote a paper and we have a little excerpt in there, and we look at Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and they share Hispaniola. They share the same island. It's the same geography. It's the same part of the earth. And when hurricanes go over that island, turns out that Haiti has large casualties. The Dominican Republic doesn't. Same storm, and that is a testament to the importance of better adapting to the environments in which we live. So people are concerned about heat waves, and they should be concerned about heat waves. One of the best things we can do to mitigate the effects of heat waves is to build more air conditioning. More air conditioning means more energy. And so the sort of things that we know how to do require development, economic growth, and consuming more energy.
So, question, you've written a bit about what you call the iron law of climate policy. And so could you briefly describe like what that is? And we've got elections coming up. So how does that play into the kinds of policies that we can anticipate going forward?
Yeah. So going back just to the beginning of the climate movement, there was a central idea, and it was driven from economics, and it's theoretically sound, is that if you put a price on something, you make it more expensive, people are going to use less of it, and they're going to look for alternatives. And so the idea was, well, if we make fossil fuels materially more expensive for people, then they're going to use less of them, and they're going to look for alternatives to fossil fuels. And that'll motivate technological innovation to bring to the market those alternatives. In theoretical economics, that makes a lot of sense. Where it fails is politics. People don't like higher prices. And it turns out that in a global economy that depends 85% on fossil fuels, efforts to make fossil fuels more expensive make everything more expensive. And when people see price inflation, they see things that cost more, they don't go out and say, give me an electric vehicle. I want to source my electricity from wind. What they say is, I'm going to vote for the person who tells me I'm going to get cheaper energy. And we see populist movements, and we see politicians promising to deal with the affordability crisis. In France, people probably remember the Yellow Vest protests. And that was people protesting over a few euro cents fuel duty. And so the iron law of climate change says that if we put in place climate policies that force a trade-off between the economy and the environment, guess what? The economy is going to win every time. And they say it's not even worth debating. It's an iron law. You show me a politician that gets elected on promising people to make everything more expensive, and then we can talk. It just doesn't work that way. And so where that leads us is to this idea that if we are going to decarbonize the economy, it has to be going with the wind at our backs in terms of economic growth, making things more affordable for normal people. This year, 2026, is really the first time in a while that I see agreement in Democrats and Republicans in the United States that, yeah, affordability matters. And we can't try to make energy more expensive. That's a non-starter. And so I'm very encouraged. Republicans have accepted the iron law for a lot longer than Democrats. in this country. But I do think the notion of an affordability crisis has kind of focused some minds on what a smarter approach to energy policy might look like.
Interesting. Yeah, we've had a couple podcasts where that comes up quite a bit, is the affordability, just general idea that didn't really exist before. I mean, kind of explain that was the general economic philosophy of maybe trying to drive renewable energy, things like that. But I don't think it's, obviously the people have to pay. So that makes sense. If that's kind of the top mind for people, which again, that's all we've kind of been hearing about recently, is that it's obviously being kind of communicated on a political level. On the activist climate policy level, are you seeing as much communication and, acknowledgement of affordability being an issue, or is it still, let's tax and remove, the incentive to buy expensive fossil fuels and go with renewables?
It's not just one thing. The loudest voices that have kind of dominated the debate have been really people who are anti-growth, anti-technology. There is a movement largely in academia called degrowthers, the idea that we'll deal with climate change by shrinking the economy. That's never going to go anywhere. I've been affiliated with colleagues, really for the last 20 years, who have tried to present climate policy as being pragmatic, being realistic. And I do think that there is a broad understanding of people who are in the climate space that iron law is real. And the only way you deal with deep decarbonization is through advancing technology that makes energy cheaper. The lowest hanging fruit by far worldwide for deeply reducing emissions is to get off of coal. Coal has served the world well since the Industrial Revolution, but it turns out we have substitutes for coal for pretty much everything, even things like, metallurgical steel and things like that. The smartest, easiest thing to do would be for the world to, instead of these, complex emissions reductions treaties, start just talking about a coal phase-out treaty. The winners in a coal phase-out would be natural gas, which is, as I mentioned, half the carbon intensity of coal, and also nuclear, which can provide enormous amounts of electricity with basically no carbon dioxide emissions. Coal is responsible for 40% of all human emissions of carbon dioxide. And so that's a big chunk we could eliminate. Now, don't underestimate the political complexities. China and India in particular are responsible for the vast majority of coal burned on the planet. And so it's very easy for United Kingdom, which is just about off coal completely, to support a coal phase-out treaty. Even in the United States, coal is at its lowest level as a percentage of energy generation as it's been ever in this country. And coal has been on its way out for a lot of reasons. Cheap natural gas is one of them. It's easier for countries like the US and the UK to support that. It's more difficult for India and China. And take a look at Germany. Germany, historically, Eastern Germany was powered by lignite, dirty coal. And they've had a very hard time. And, the Chancellor of Germany just in the last few weeks admitted, maybe shutting down all those nuclear power plants wasn't the smartest idea we ever had. The president of the European Commission said the same thing just this week. So there are, technological options for deep reductions in emissions that wind up costing people less, have more reliability, more cost certainty, and as we're seeing, more energy security. Nuclear power, I'm a big fan. I think that's it's available. It's phasing out coal is possible. So let's do the easy things first and worry about the hard stuff later.
Yeah, it's interesting. Comments you made about coal is, you in the U.S., I'm sure you're aware of this, emissions went up last year from, generating energy for the first time in a while. And the primary reason for that was coal was used for a greater share, primarily because the price of natural gas went up. Talking about development-driven adaptation. And I'm just wondering, could you just define what that means, and then does it suggest that climate investments should focus more, or not necessarily instead of renewables development or natural, cleaner energy development, but should there be more of an effort to focus on how we adapt to some of the changes that we're likely to see over the next century?
Yeah, that paper, it's a preprint. It's led by my super colleague, Matt Burgess, University of Wyoming. And the idea there, it's pretty straightforward, is that the notion of adapting to climate, a lot of people in the climate space define it very narrowly. We're just going to adapt to the changes. Forget about climate variability and the baseline climate. We're just going to adapt to the changes. And our argument is that, by developing our societies, by becoming richer, more robust, more resilient. If everybody has an air conditioner, they're happier, they're cooler, and then they're better adapted to heat waves. And it's not a rocket science argument. At the same time, we argue that reducing emissions is a worthwhile goal, but if the cost of reducing emissions is a noticeable hit on GDP growth, that's going to hurt the development driven adaptation side of things. That could make people materially worse off. And so where we land is a design principle for thinking about energy policy and emissions reductions, that those policies have to contribute to economic growth. And if they don't, they're probably not the best policies. So it seems pretty straightforward, but I mean, there is a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, flippant or blasé discussions in climate space that, what's a 1% hit to GDP if we stop climate change? Well, a 1% hit to GDP, if that's worldwide, that's probably tens of millions of deaths of people around the world, because a richer world is a safer world. A richer world is a world in which we're more resilient to whatever Mother Nature throws at us, whether it's caused by humans or contributed to by humans. And so for better or worse, people like being wealthier, and being wealthier is associated with being safer and being better adapted to this crazy world we live in. So these are pretty straightforward, I think, pretty simple common sense principles, but they must not be, because we've been pursuing climate policies for the last few decades that don't take these into account.
So we're all part of the midstream industry. It sounds, as I'm listening to coal moving out, natural gas kind of filling the gap. Is there, any opinion that you would have on how people in the midstream working can work with, climate advisors, policymakers, things like that, just even the public on what we do and how we can help during this time?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any specific advice. I get, in my line of work, I'm lucky. I get to talk to people all across the energy economy and all around the world. And one of the messages I try to bring to folks is, number one, embrace the science. It's actually more consistent with the view that we need more energy and the world's going to depend on fossil fuels for, rest of my life, even if it's a diminishing share of the economy. Consuming fossil fuels does not directly contribute to hurricanes or floods, and, stick to what the IPCC says, but there are smart things that can be done. So the United States has seen emissions go down, as you mentioned, Kevin, up until last year, since 2005. And the reason for that is, the shale revolution, which I say, it's an overnight success story that was like 30 years in the making, that goes back to public-private partnerships in the 1970s, basic R&D that nobody was paying attention to, that bore fruit when some smart guys in industry capitalized on it and turned it into making the U.S. the world's leading producer of natural gas. Natural gas, to the extent it displaces coal anywhere in the world, reduces emissions. Does it reduce them to zero? Absolutely not. But is it important? Yes. And the big issue there, again, it's not technology, it's politics and geopolitics. As we're seeing just now with the Iran war, you take natural gas offline. If Qatar shuts down, then that puts a lot of countries into a difficult situation. And so security of supply, trust among countries, international trade is really important for sustaining continued advancements in energy. And so I'm a big fan of countries, like the United Kingdom has a huge, I lived in the United Kingdom for a little while at Oxford when I was there. And there's a debate there over whether they should exploit North Sea gas reserves, whether they should do domestic fracking and so on. If you want security of supply, getting natural gas from your friends, or even better, from your backyard, is a path to higher energy security. Turns out energy security is just as important, probably more important politically than climate change. And so energy is, I raise it as it's a stool with many legs. Sure, there's human impacts on the environment. That's one leg. But so is the security of supply. So is energy access. There are plenty of people around the world who would love to have the choices we have with energy services. And then there's the energy economy. We talked about the iron law. And it used to be, for a lot of the last decade, that academics, people in the science community, would talk about climate policy as if it was the umbrella. And energy policy sat underneath that umbrella. And it turns out, and I think this is a healthy evolution, people are starting to realize, no, climate policy is important, but it's a subset of energy policy. And so I think people inside industry and outside industry talk about the big umbrella. And you can acknowledge the reality and the importance of dealing with climate change, but at the same time, everybody else has to acknowledge the importance of, we want the lights to come on. I want my bills to be small. I don't want to see profound disruption to fertilizer and fossil fuel supplies around the world that are going to disrupt lives and cost lives eventually. And so energy policy is fascinating. It's important, and too much of it has become partisan in the US. And I think this broader discussion where climate change is part of the conversation, it's not the conversation, it represents a healthy evolution. And I'd love to see more people in the industry talking more about the big picture and the big umbrella. I mean, and I gave the same message to my climate advocate friends who are, they eat, drink, breathe climate change, but that's just one leg of the stool. It's not going to stand very well.
Well, Roger, we're running up on time, so I want to invite everyone to check out the Honest Broker Substack and check out your work. It's fascinating to see. I also follow you a little bit on social media as well, so get a plug in there. But we always wrap up the podcast with a same or similar question. And earlier in our conversation, you said, climate change is still an issue or a concern, but it doesn't mean that climate change is the same issue that it was a generation ago. So the question that we like to ask is, you're back on the show in 3 years from now, and maybe in climate's case, we need to extend that timeline a little bit, but you're back on the show in the future and you're happy. What has gone on over the past 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever that has caused you to be happy about where we sit with climate and all things?
Yeah, you should have asked me that 3 years ago, because then that would have been this discussion I'm having with you. For me, 3 years from now, this moment of evolution in thinking about energy and climate towards a much more grounded pragmatism, realism. The example I often use is Mark Carney in Canada, who went from being a central banker and a climate champion. All he talked about was climate and making it so important. And guess what? You become a politician, you're leading a country, you become Prime Minister of Canada, and now he's talking about building pipelines and making Canada energy dominant whilst it's still dealing with climate change. So 3 years from now, I hope that there are politicians like we saw this week in Europe who are admitting that the nuclear phase out was a pretty boneheaded move. That we just see more and more of that. The United States needs a lot more pragmatism, a lot less partisanship. And so I do think energy is, if we can't achieve bipartisanship on energy in the United States, we can't achieve bipartisanship on anything. So I'm hoping that 3 years from now, what will that be? We'll have a new president, and hopefully there's a bipartisan discussion in Congress where everybody's focused on how do we deliver affordable, secure, reliable energy to everybody to grow the economy while dealing with climate change. Wouldn't that be great?
Great answer. So much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode, and we look forward to hearing from you next time.